à tous. Quelques-uns d'entre vous, peut-être beaucoup, j'espère, ont suivi les précédentes.
Some of you may have listened to the previous World Writers' Conference. Let me say a few words to explain what it's all about for those of you coming for the first time. This idea came from Nick Barley, who's the president of the Word Alliance. The Word Alliance brings together 8 literary festivals, including Malo, since last year. This exists with support from the British Council. And it goes back to a writers' conference that was held in 1962 in Edinburgh, which brought together some very major writers of the time who felt that they had reached a time of great change in the world. And so they decided to discuss what was at stake for fiction and literature at the time. The discussions were organized around 5 topics, and the idea here with the World Writers' Conference is to pick up the same 5 themes to look at what had changed in the intervening time. And because, once again, we feel today that we're changing worlds, or that the world is changing, and that the question of literature is again very topical. And the festival actually is built around this idea. You may have followed some of the discussions bringing together writers and ethnologists and historians. It's interesting that in times of crisis, there's always questions being raised about fiction, with ethnologists asking aloud, why is it that writers can better relate what is the very topic of our discipline, that is looking at other cultures. And the same sort of thing occurs in history, and the same for psychoanalysis. Why is it that psychoanalysts who tend to be fairly arrogant, are they so prone to quoting writers, even though they themselves are not writers? It's as though they're in pursuit of something in literature, something that they themselves, as psychoanalysts, they can't reach. So what question is raised by literature in the history of humanity? Many things have been done without literature, saying, for instance, this is the purview of science, for instance, and confining literature to an area where it is necessarily self-referential, where it becomes formal. And now the fact that social sciences are bringing up literature is something meaningful. So the moment is critical. We're at a crossroads, and we are now picking up these 5 topics. These discussions are filmed, recorded. They will be on the websites of Le Point, of France Culture. And The Guardian has picked up the texts of the authors, the keynote writers. Let me just talk about the way it's organized. When we first started, there were 8 festivals. Today, there are 15 of them. So this is truly the widest and broadest debate that has ever been organized on the issue of literature. With 15 festivals, so we're talking about 500 to 700 writers throughout the world who will have taken part in these World Writers' Conference. And the end goal is, at the end of the process, there'll be a book that will compile all of the contributions to the keynote speakers. The book will be published in all of the languages involved. And the whole idea is to have this book come out at the same time in each language in each one of the festivals. So it's really a fantastic undertaking, adventure. And in Brazzaville, when we organized a fairly significant festival in February, and these debates were fascinating. It was almost as if we were really taking stock of all of African literature in one go. You can find this on the site of Étonnant Voyageur. So we follow the same system. We have a keynote speaker who reads a text, which basically serves as a springboard, and that text will actually be included in the book, and that is, as I said, the springboard for the discussion. The discussion is amongst writers, and then later on, the audience will be invited to ask questions. Towards the end of the session, we'll see how it goes. So that's the general idea. Keynote speaker, then other participating panelists, and then open to Q&A from the audience. You have your headsets, you know how it works. It means that some of our non-French speaking writers, I think Nick Longo is here, I'd like to welcome him, so they can speak in their own language, because to talk about things that are fairly specific, it's always better to speak in one's native language. And so to give you the greatest comfort possible, we have this opportunity of interpretation, French and English. So, hello. Our debate is on the future of the novel. We have writers with us. Vassili Atsikris, Mabille, Serge Bramdy, Clément Camdy, Maryse Condé, Diana Evans, Percival Everett, Kalgout, Nick Longo, Hubert Haddad, and others. But all of you can speak later on. I'd simply like to remind you of one thing. For those of you who are filming, for those who are watching, each person should, before speaking, stand up and introduce themselves so that we know who is speaking. And now we will give the floor to Michel Lebris for the inaugural introduction on the future of the novel. A very dark one, and perhaps none at all. This is a view expressed with grave concern the most highly regarded critics at a time when we all sense that we are entering with a new century a period of momentous change. How could we fail to perceive that the new era brings with it a new sensibility and a fundamental changes in our mental bearings, standing on the threshold of a new century? Fear not. I speak, of course, of the dying days of the 19th century and the start of the deeply troubling 20th century. In 1891, Jules Romain had prophesied the end of the novel form. The same year, Ludovic Halévy agreed, all novel genres have been exhausted. Édouard Rode then added, the novel has no future. And in fact, the French novel is dead. This is in the words of Jean Laurent in 1905. The French novel has been killed by journalism. Maurice Leblanc, the very same year, qualified the verdict, saying the novel was in its death throes, a victim of these industrial times when the launch of a book is not dramatically different from, say, the launch of a new cocktail. Or, as Lucien Maury was to claim in 1907, it had fallen victim to Parisianism, snobism, a mix of cruel and light irony, dryness of sentiment, and moral skepticism. In short, as Camille Audigier railed in 1901, we've had enough of these adulterous mondaines and swooning neurasthenics. That was in 1911. Enough of this agitation and theatricality, chimed in Louis Bertrand in 1912. It seemed as if there was nothing left to rejoice over. Gide, when asked by a major newspaper in 1913 to name his 10 favorite French novels, wondered if French letters could even lay claim to the novel as a form. This long preamble is in fact intended to urge all of us to take an optimistic view. All of this took place a century ago, and we are still here. We continue to ponder, to question, to argue just as passionately as we did then, and often in the same terms. So much so that one could hold that the novel form thrives in times of crisis, and that concern over its future is actually a sign of good health. Indeed, it was then that some new voices emerged. Marcel Schwab, who was discovering the work of Stevenson in the flickering light of a railroad lamp. He found what might be expected of the times, an adventure novel that wove together the crises of the inner and outer worlds. Camille Mauclair saw the novel of tomorrow, and he saw in Stevenson the model of a novel that was free from social determinisms à la Zola and individual psychology à la Barrès. André Gide, at that time, discovered Conrad and undertook to translate Typhoon. In 1913, Jacques Rivière published his spectacular adventure novel in 3 installments in the NRF, a journal, in the form of a manifesto. Then there were various collections in Plomb, Feu Croisé, Cosmos en Cabinet, It Stuck. And just as many were lamenting the novel as a lost cause, French readers were able to discover in rapid succession the likes of Dostoevsky, Melville, Thomas Mann, Rilke, Hamsun, Kafka, Henry James, Kipling, James Joyce, Pirandello, George Eliot, Thomas Hardy, Conrad. In other words, proof of the amazing ability of fiction to relate the world in the very process of becoming. And a new generation of French writers was to follow, many of them who were going to be travel writers and keen to take to the road. So one might wonder if it is not precisely in periods of crisis and profound change that fiction deploys its full power. Suffice it to think of Conrad's Heart of Darkness or Journey to the End of the Night by Céline. The debates and controversies are strangely familiar. They took place a century ago, but they ring just as true today. So there are grounds for optimism. But what precisely can we be optimistic about? That means that we will not be talking about internet, digitization, or the programmed obsolescence of paper. And it is always predicated on the assumption that the globalized market leads to fatal outcomes. Some of the writers who initiate these debates and other festivals have gotten bogged down in them. I know that the digital revolution will have an impact on the very form of works through the new opportunities it creates in terms of images, sound, of branching, of interactivity, just to name a few. And not to mention the huge potential it holds for places like Africa, where books struggle to survive. As we know, and the festival has endeavored to show this, that new literary forms are emerging. Notwithstanding the medium of production, whether paper or digital, these are made up of a blending of previously separate genres, fiction, storytelling, essays, in a shifting and dynamic balance, as if the ability to switch between genres compensated for the ever-present risk of the others failing to deliver. Back in 1992, when I was director of the Voyageur collection with Bayeux, we published John McPhee. He was the pioneer of a new genre that would become known as creative nonfiction, that we seem to be finally discovering here in France. And actually, there was an extensive session dedicated to creative nonfiction here in Malo yesterday. This, I believe, shows just how important these developments are. However, and this might come as a surprise, as important as they might be, I believe they are actually secondary. Not negligible, but secondary, in that they come after what is essential. What I mean by essential is the ability to perceive what is at stake in novel writing, therefore, to understand why the novel form is more necessary today than ever before. When, back in 1990, I created the Étonnant Voyageur Festival, which owes its name to a well-known Baudelaire poem, it was a survival instinct on my part. I wanted to open a space in which I, as a writer, I could breathe freely, standing in opposition to the literary fashions that were then ruling over the French literary scenes, both an avant-garde ideology that postulated that literature had but one object, itself, thus reducing it to nothing more than formal play. And once you've done that, what is left? So it was just a play on words. And there was another fashion which is completely tied to it, the marveling and the contemplation of one's own navel, which is taken to be the one and only center of the world. As for me, I wanted to assert that never has literature been as strong, as alive, and as needed as when it has taken on relating the world. A world was disappearing. This I felt with great intensity, inasmuch as my generation had dreamed of doing away with the old world, I lived very intensely through the lovely days of May 1968 in Paris. The shockwaves of this movement that took various forms and then acquired a global dimension had shaken the whole edifice, toppling the ideologies that the reigning thinking gurus claimed covered the whole range of thought. It carried our most trusted reference points and many of our certainties away, save for one that actually led to the birth of Étonnant Voyageur, that only artists and writers can delve into the unknown and give it a voice. Thus, it always is. May 1968 and those events, which had not been foreseen by the specialists, remember the very infamous words of the most famous of all of Le Monde's editorialists, France is bored. This pronouncement was made 13 days before the start of the events. Yet, the movement that had not been foreseen by the pundits had already been in the works for a decade through music, comics, science fiction, everything we called at the time counterculture. All the worthy pundits, be they specialists in politics, economics, and sociology, had been deaf and blind to, as they are still today. And this is for a reason that is perfectly evident, and that is that deaf specialists of what is already known, and thus they're the less well suited to perceive novelty and breaks. Better to listen to Bob Dylan than to read editorials in Le Monde if one wanted to understand the rising tide of the 60s. The only specialists of the unknown that I know of are artists. Specialists, of course, quote, in inverted commas. Artists and writers. As a result, they are needed with a renewed and special urgency in this period of momentous change, and thus it is that the novel form is critical to our times. Possibly even more so than one can imagine, for the changes we are undergoing are completely singular. We have thought for centuries in terms of stable categories: nation-states, territories, borders, foreign domestic oppositions, families, communities, identities, but also concepts. Concepts are by definition stable, and this is something that philosophers have held from Socrates' times onward. It may well be that the world to come very quickly forces us to ditch stable categories and to risk ourselves into moving thought. In other words, as the Indian philosopher Arjun Appadurai puts it, in modernity at large. That was very poorly translated into French, incidentally, but never mind that. So, as Arjun Appadurai said, it forces us into thinking in terms of flows and no longer in terms of structures. That means flows of populations, unprecedented, whether voluntary or imposed, flows of images, flows of sounds, flows of information in every area. They're followed by fantastic cultural collisions, a veritable maelstrom in which old world expires while a new one is being born, the outlines of which we can hardly perceive, even though we know it will force us to rethink our mental coordinates. It is becoming vital for individual and collective imaginations both to get back to center stage in terms of power of creation. We are entering a world in which it is not exaggerated to say that someone born into one culture will be led to live in another, or that a second-generation immigrant will be torn apart between two worlds or two cultures. In fact, this can occur within one's own country thanks to the acceleration of transfers of rural populations with traditional cultures to tradition-crushing, family-rending megalopolises, in which in their turn are also source of new social behaviors and new cultures. And I think the creators from Nigeria and South Africa have well spoken about this. So these will create new cultures. In short, a world in which imaginary, flowing, perpetually renewed plural communities will be born, will constantly change and will disappear. But it is also a world in which everyone standing at a crossroads of multiple identities will find themselves forced to invent their personal story in order to make sense of themselves, which will make a coherent whole of this multiplicity. What is true for each and everyone will be true for whole communities. So this means it's a dangerous world in which the imagination will always be challenged at the risk of hankering after nostalgic roots, be they real or fantasized after illusory homelands, all the more murderous as they are disconnected from reality after dreamt of undivided communities in which we can be among ourselves, delivered from the tragedy of history when one wants to reject the new world with all one's might, which not far from us is what they call ethnic cleansing or delusional identity wishes or genocidal mania. But this is also a fascinating world in which creative fiction will play a central part, something that Arjun Appadurai appears to have overlooked in his essay, perhaps because of his perspective as a sociologist. So I'm extrapolating, because what is novel? It is, of course, the creation of worlds, the crisscrossing of multiple voices, the questioning in its very movement of the certainties of identity. Of course, it is a form, but it's an open form, a flowing one, unlike concepts, and therefore at the origin of togetherness. It is in action thought, the thought of flow. It explores a flowing space in which the inside and the outside becomes interchangeable and in which the self can deconstruct and reconstruct itself. Thus, literature, and particularly the novel, stand more than ever at the core of what the world to come holds at stake. Fiction, once again, is center stage. It is striking that the social sciences and literature are tackling similar issues. It's very new and it's fascinating, and we've heard this in various discussions. Again, they're tackling the similar issues. This is after a period during which social sciences attempted to displace literature after placing it behind bars. Do we learn less from Conrad and Stevenson about the tropics than we learned from Malinowski? Or about man and society from Proust and Chateaubriand than from Lévi-Strauss? Why do writers do a better job of telling us about the world than recognized anthropologists? This is a question posed by Alain Bensa and François Pouillon, both anthropologists, in their collective work that's called Land of Writers. And they essentially put this question to anthropologists. Sylvie Laurent, you may have heard her here yesterday, discussing with David Simon, who is a historian fascinated by the impact of the TV series The Wire. Writing for the magazine Esprit asks, what if fiction were closer to the truth than the social sciences? An idea apparently appealing to sociologists, since David Simon, the author of the series, gets invited to a lecture at Harvard. So as I was saying earlier, why is it that psychoanalysts, whose knowledge is often tinged with arrogance, quote so liberally from literary works, although they're not writers? This is the question that psychoanalyst Pierre Bayard asked in his own book. Can literature be applied to psychoanalysis? It's almost as though literature holds a form of knowledge that psychoanalysis is eternally searching for but unable to reach. The very topic of another recent book on Freud and writers. In a book that just came out, 15 young historians ponder the question, what are historians thinking about? Well, they're thinking about literature, of course, to the point of obsession, expresses with dismay a critic from Le Monde. It has taken on an obsessional dimension through various colloquia in Lyon, at the Collège de France, SNRS, while the journal Sciences Humaines devotes a special issue to literature window on the world, not to mention all the philosophers who have reflected on the power of literature, such as Pierre Casounogas, a philosopher who came here last year, who takes it quite far as he posits that philosophy is fiction. So why is it that everybody all of a sudden is so intent on the power of literature? The fact that the social science is thrown into crisis as a result of the general state of upheaval in the world are looking to the powers of literature especially meaningfully, and we should heed this. as it shows that the arrogant theories that allow the social sciences to exist entirely self-referentially, excluding the outside world, are truly dead. And this is in the admission of those who actually developed these theories in the 50s. And this brings us back to literature's ability to relate the world. I have no complaint. This has been my position since the festival was created. And this is what led me to espouse led me in 2008 to the drafting, along with several other writers, a manifesto for French language world literature. And this manifesto was co-authored with Jean Roux, Alain Mambancou, and others, and it was signed by 44 writers. So this is what I've fought for since my first book came out in 1977. It is not all about signs or systems of signs, contrary to what the gurus of structuralism tried to drum into us. The unutterable exists, and literature exists precisely because the unutterable exists, as does humanity with the acceptance of the other. If everything could be uttered, if everything were transparent, translatable, exchangeable, everything would have been said, and we would not write stories. But the fact is, we never stopped, whenever, wherever, in all places, in all countries, to tell stories. So such obstinacy makes one suppose that there must be some imperious necessity to make it rise to the surface, to take us to the core of its mystery. We are, to quote Nancy Houston's beautiful expression, a storytelling species. How strange is fiction? It is not truth, obviously, but neither is it untruth. Evidently, it says something. Otherwise, we would be indifferent. But not so. We read it voraciously. We cannot be stopped. We are enthralled. It says something which cannot be said in any other way. Its figurative meaning cannot be reduced to literal meaning. If it could, fiction would be an ornament, kids' play, a waste of time. But we experience it as essential. When we finish reading a great novel, do we not have the feeling that it was delivering something unique about the world and human beings? Perhaps even more, the feeling that allows the perception of the unknown world to come. It gives it a face. It makes it inhabitable. It makes us discover the other in ourselves. Fiction is neither truth nor untruth. Thus, it forces us to suggest there is another way of knowledge than the discursive, that of imagination. It forces us to think in terms of creative imagination. I've been long. If a work written several centuries ago in another culture can still move me when the times that saw it come to life are long gone and its context, of which I know nothing, has been abolished, it must mean that there is something in it that which cannot be reduced to the conditions of its enunciation, something that is capable of overcoming death and the passing of time, and beyond the narrow confines of culture is capable of talking still to our present. Has it not been said that a true work of art can be recognized and that it has passed the test of time? But if there is transcendence in a work of art, it becomes obvious that it is due to a dimension of transcendence in its creator, due to a power in him, and therefore in his readers. That is to say, in every man that crosses over time and culture. And the power of works of literature is to continuously bring us back to this dimension within us that we tend to forget, caught up as we are in everyday life. Perhaps our questioning about literature will appear futile to today's great minds. They would have us believe that the time is now for serious matters. In their shadow theaters, they have attempted to bring back to life old tired slogans. In turn, let us not be afraid to assert that the human poem we carry within ourselves and the richness of fiction is what brings us back to the essential in these chaotic times, this greatness in each one of us, which producing and consuming have not yet exhausted, a power of creation that is the very essence of being human. Our need for the novel is therefore as imperious and real as it has ever been. We believe that no thought of the new times, no policy, no philosophy will be worth anything if it is not built on an idea which is vaster than man and which artists and poets invariably take us back to. In 1981, in an essay titled Lost Paradise, I wagered that out of the ruins of the theoretical age, there would be a new age of fiction. These words may not have been heard at the time, but 30 years later, I do not believe that I was wrong in making this statement.
Il me semble pas que tu as tardé. Il me semble pas que tu as tardé. C'était.
It seems that to me that it was about the right length for the presentation. So this is the lecture made by Michel. I can see many writers, Leonora Miano, and I'm waiting for your reactions, and I'd like us to have a debate around this issue of the future of the novel. I'm Serge Bramley, and I'm a novel writer. The future of the novel is, in a way, the future of opponents to the novel. I really believe in what can be called dialogue in the best of cases, or conflict when the dialogue becomes too violent. But in both situations, whether it's a dialogue or conflict, very often the enemy sets the tone and allows us to move forward. Michel was talking about the 19th century, which is the golden age of the novel, when at least novels started to appear. We had people like Dumas and Hugo, but it took them a long time to come to the novel as a form and publish The Misérables or Les Trois Mousquetaires. They were first and foremost theatre writers. Theatre was a noble art and novel was vulgar. And the opposition play novel was probably very productive in the birth of the novel as an art form, and it's generally through opposition that things move forward. Among the many prophets of the death of the novel, quoted by Michel, some said journalism will definitely kill novel. In my young age, people said television would kill the novel as an art form. The cinema, as well, for a long time was seen as a scourge against which the novel could not fight. The truth is, each and every time, the enemies of the novel, the opponents, provided an opportunity for the novel to reinvent itself, to work on its shape, to transfigure itself, and to advance and to progress. Now, funnily enough, cinema seems to have given up. I'm not talking, there are always exceptions, of course. There are many, many good movies still being published. But when we look at the work of major cinema studios for reasons of merchandising, for purely mercantile reasons, very often they target the very young as an audience. Major effect movies. We no longer have things like Lawrence of Arabia, what we had 40 or 50 years ago, but today we're looking at mega productions aimed at the 13 to 14 years old. And it's great because it's one less enemy, one less opponent to the novel. On the contrary, the TV soap, the TV series has become the true enemy of the novel, because a series takes about the same time as a novel. If you're watching a series, you're spending a lot of hours following the plot, getting attached to the characters. The Wire, for example, there's an ethnological quality to The Wire because the time of the series is helping us being really immersed in the world of the dockers, for example. So we are at a time of revival for the novel, I think, thanks to this new enemy, to this new opponent. And it is through the virtue of the fight that we get stronger. If we don't die, we will get stronger. Thus died, but because they gave up to their enemy. As long as the novel is capable to stand back, to fight back its different opponents, the novel is alive and kicking. The true problem is what will happen when all the opponents will be knocked out. If the novel is trying to fight on the same ground, or if the novel is trying to integrate the different forms and shapes, then it might fall into tautology, repetition, etc. But the main advantage of the new technologies, I know that Michel doesn't want us to talk too much about new technologies, but still, the main advantage of technological changes is that it will bring about new opponents, and we'll see the fight becoming more and more interesting. That's very true. But the novel, and this is extraordinary, is feeding upon its opponent. It's feeding upon opposition. It's extraordinarily plastic, flexible compared to other art forms. Novel at the beginning meant written in the Roman language for lay people, in opposition to what was written in Latin for the learned population. So it was this conflict between what is produced for the elite, and what is produced for the masses. This game never stopped, in a way. You were talking about the novel at the Romantic time, at the Romantic period, after the novel of the 18th, where there is no dialogue. I remember one critic, the main critic of the time, really offended by the success of Les Mystères de Paris. Balzac is writing series novels at the beginning, and the main critic said at the same time, it's a scandal. People no longer read, they devour, they want to get to the end. They're not really enjoying the beauty of a sentence. They want to know about the plot, and this is extremely vulgar. This sums up something quite important, and the romantic novel is born out of the opportunity of being published in newspapers on a daily basis. So people start reading every day the adventures of their main character in the Mystères de Paris from Sue. And it is the dialogues that we find in Boulevard du Crime and the narration techniques from the long haul novel, the series novel, that are going to bring about the romantic novel, the great novel. It stimulates the renewal. What we don't find in the avant-garde novels, what is left out, is that we need codes that can be understood by the majority of readers. And if you do away with the codes, you do away with the connection. The novel dries up and dies. Falters and dies. I remember I remember what Ricardo was saying in the 60s. It was probably quite nice, but very judgmental. And he published a book on the different narration techniques invented by the Nouveau Roman. And it was quite funny to read, really, because all the narration techniques were the techniques used by the cinema industry at the time, that were integrated by novel. The long Balzac-like descriptions are no longer possible today because we've been changed by being exposed to cinema. But really, the novel integrated new codes, the codes of the cinema, to have a closer connection with the audience. And this is what makes me optimist. What is David Simon doing when he does Tremé? In a way, he's asking Denis Lehan and Pellecanos to write the scenarios with him, and in a way, he's reinventing what the series novel was at the time, and he reinvented so much that narration techniques used by American cinema producers are taking over the same techniques, even unwittingly. For example, you always need an even number of events in a scenario. Amédée Achard, who's forgotten about today, who wrote The Adventures of Mr. Lagarche, invented that. He was a great storyteller, and he said, if you want to keep the reader interested, you need an event to be ongoing, you need an event to start, and you need an event to finish. You always need 3 events to be kept rolling, 3 or 5 or 7. You need an uneven number of events. And look at what's happening in the American TV series that are really fashionable. There's always an uneven number of parallel actions or parallel events ongoing. This is a constant, this is a recurrent pattern, and I find it fascinating, this capacity to absorb or integrate what comes from another form of art. I'm not scared by the development of heroic fantasy, or that's what the novel is there for, to absorb new techniques, and as long as it can integrate and absorb other techniques, it will keep alive and kicking.
Please stand up and your name.
Sorry, my name is Khabetli Mele. First thing I would like to say, I'm a writer. I hate to say I'm a South African writer because I'm a world writer. As you are all here, we're writers, and my work is being translated into French and into Italian, so I can't say I'm a South African writer, whereas Italians are reading me and French are reading me as well. So I would like to look at writers as writers, because it's to say to magnify me to the last and say I'm a South African writer, whereas I'm writing not only for the South Africans, I'm writing for the whole world. And one of the first points that I want to say, the first thing I would say about the evolution of a human being. When the human evolved, they evolved from being an ape over a number of years until to the form that I am in. And this is the perfect form that we're all in. A car was invented in the late 1900s and in the early 1900s. And now when you see a car, they have reached a form where they are perfect. There's nothing they can add more. They can add a navigational system, anything they add to it, but it remains a perfect something. So like all human beings, the book has evolved, because I had an argument with one of my friends in the township when he was saying that Julius Caesar was a good book. I said, no, it's not a good book, it's a good play. And it became an argument because he looked at Julius Caesar as a fiction novel. I said, no, it's not a novel. I looked at it as a stage play, which I think, personally, I think is a stage play. And then we started to have an argument about it, and it leads me back to the evolution of the human being, because a human being was first an ape. He moved, he changed. And this is the evolution of the book. It has evolved from being a stage play, and then it became a novel, it became a fiction, and then now we have what my friend Kevin says, it's a narrative non-fiction. And so all these things, they lead into a very pure, perfect way of saying this is a book. And the feature of the book is not, I don't see any thread. My friend here on my left says it has enemies. But the enemies, the films, the Twitters, everything, what they do, they can't take anything from the book. All they do, they will add something, because at the end of the day, people are writing. It's the same as you look at art. Art, when we're talking about the great artist, Michelangelo and the likes, you find there was a time where they were doing their job and they were famous in their times. And along the way, we still have artists who are still drawing oil on canvas. And at the same time, what happened between the two arts, drawing art and film, are the same thing, and they're portraying life in a way, but they're not threatened by each other. It's just the level of how each is accepted by the community. When you come to my country, you tell them about Michelangelo, they would have no idea what you're talking about. But I think if you were to come to my country during the 50s and the 60s, they would have an idea who's Michelangelo and about his work. So at the same time, the novel, I think, is not threatened by the films, the other industries that are surrounding it. It becomes a platform where each gets its own fuel, because without the writing first, without the idea, there wouldn't be a good film. And so my view of the thing is the novel will still hold water, whether it's an e-book or whether it's a hard copy. they are all going to be still, it's still going to be part of our future. And there is one more thing where you have the internal fight within the book itself, where as writers from everywhere, writers from South America, from Asia, from France, we're looking to write something that will better the other ones. And in my language, I've been talking to my fellow South Africans, where we were trying to define the greatest South African novel, but it becomes, we couldn't come to a clear conclusion, as again, we couldn't really identify the greatest novel of all times. And at the same time, we are in a process as writers to keep writing. And if I can say, here we have about 300 writers, and our function as writers, we keep going on. We're writing. We're not stopping and saying people are not buying books. We're not stopping and saying, no, I'm from South Africa and then I don't have a market. I don't make a living out of writing. We keep on writing. So this is the internal strive as writers that we have put on the stage, where every novel, when I'm sit down and I'm writing it hoping that it will get read. And I know that maybe something will happen in it, with it. And at the same time, it keeps the whole book thing going on. Because when you look at the whole thing, the last statistics that I had was at the Cape Town Book Fair, where they had more than 1,000 novels that were at the book fair. All were recently published, and about 600 of them were South African novels. And it gives you an idea of, if you were to count all the books that are published every year in the world, it means I'm looking at a very good future of the book, because the book is still going to be with us, whether we are afraid of something, whether we are afraid of any of the things that would come up. But the book, I believe, will still stand because of itself. Within itself, it is fighting. Me as a writer, I'm fighting to write. At the present moment, I'm writing 2 to 3 novels at the same time, and gives a good indication that we are going somewhere. We're not looking at death of the novel. We're looking at the future, and a great future of a novel. And I can say, within my colleagues that I know, all of them are writing 2 to 3 books at the same time. He's pushing 2 projects, and my friend Nick Mhlongo here is doing the same as well. So you find he's writing 3 novels at the same time, and it gives me an indication that, no, whether we can be worried about looking into the future and understanding it, but the novel will always be here with us. And the other thing was the form. I believe the form of the novel has evolved in a way, because it's no longer like the olden way of where you're having a structure and you have to put flesh on the structure. But the novel in itself has changed. One example will be my first published book. It has a little lag. It doesn't really have a good focus in it. The form itself, it sort of, because many people who read the book, they felt that they read the novel, but the novel didn't have really a focus of what it was saying. But then, again, they enjoyed the book. And so I was thinking about the form. I think the form will change. There will always be new kind of literature where they will try to narrow it down and say, no, this is romance literature, this is what. But again, it's a contribution to the whole thing that we call the book. Thank you.
Thanks.
Tu veux répondre? Non, je crois effectivement que ce qui est passionnant, c'est...
I do indeed believe that what's fascinating is the very fact that new forms are emerging. You referred to creative nonfiction that I also referred to, and there was a discussion last night about creative nonfiction. It's basically come in the footsteps of new journalism, and it's another way of telling the world Why is it, for instance, that travel writing has a literary dimension that journalism doesn't? And creative nonfiction came about in response to a feeling that there was an inadequacy in novels. But things have changed a little bit. When I talk about new forms emerging, I'm struck by the fact there are novels being written with aspects of experimentation and journalistic investigation, as if each novel basically strives to challenge the old styles, the old rhetorical devices, the things that have been exhausted in the other genres. I'm thinking of Maximum City by Segumo Seta. It's as if there's a desire to get away from the novel conventional form, yet there's only fiction can really translate the complexity of the real world. At the same time, there's thinking involved, so then you kind of drift towards essay. But we know that we should not be sort of confined by the boundaries of essay writing, where there's not really room to investigate the plurality of points of view, a problem that you don't have with fiction. So these unstable or sort of shifting forms, I find to be really interesting. And once again, David Simon, as author of his series, is very interesting because his research work is just phenomenal. And that's the foundation of his series. There was a book that came out in France recently, and Tavernier said it was a masterpiece. It's Baltimore. This is David Simon's book. He spent so much time. He went into such detail. He had empathy for all of his characters, bad guys, cops, everything. So we're moving into something that's entirely new. Okay, it's a piece of investigative work. It's a log. It's also an absolutely fabulous novel about the real world in Baltimore. In Baltimore, which of course is the scene for first the series called The Coroner and then The Wire. And then when he goes on to Tremy, we see very well with the camera techniques, we see that new characters in New Orleans are appearing in the series. There's a kind of shifting but dynamic balance between what is more investigative work or, reality filming and fiction. And we need to be attentive to this because we're seeing that this is spreading, which is not by way of saying that this is the form for the future. There are many, many forms that will be coming about, and that's why the novel form is so rich, because it allows for that multiple development.
Sorry. David Van, and I actually write creative nonfiction. I have a couple books of creative nonfiction. One will come out in France a year from now, a portrait of a mass murderer, a school shooter. And it's investigative journalism, but it's written using the techniques of a novel, staying very close to the shooter as if he's a protagonist in fiction, and also blending some of my own memoir, inheriting guns and such in there. But I had asked for the microphone to respond to the influence of theater in novel and thinking about the shape and future of the novel. I write Greek tragedy, essentially, in my novels. There's a primary relationship being examined very closely, father and son, or marriage, or mother and son. They're put under pressure until they break, come close to dramatic unities. The characters act unconsciously and don't know why they're doing what they're doing. They love each other but hurt each other. They start in a kind of stasis. All these things are from 2,500 years ago, from Greek tragedy. And what's interesting to me is that it's tragedy which has endured across several forms, across plays, and then also across novels. And what's also interesting to me is that I actually don't write novels, but no one notices. I only have one that's actually a novel, Désolation in French or Caribou Island in English. But my others are actually what we would call a novella in English, which is 2 points of crisis, the second one coming from the first. And the language and pacing is more of a short story. But those are marketed as novels in many languages, and everyone accepts them as novels and believes that they are. So I think if the novel dies, it may be that no one notices.
Hubert Haddad. Ici, le micro, s'il vous plaît. Ici, ici. Oui. Ah, vous voulez parler? Je vous avais pas vu, pardon. D'accord, très bien.
On peut se lever.
Oui, s'il vous plaît.
Hubert Haddad. Ce que je voulais dire, c'est qu'il y a toujours eu... On a fait tout à l'heure... On a dit que le roman, c'est vrai.
We said that the novel, and this is true, that there was an opposition with dominant genres. There's an economic issue, but the novel has always existed. Whatever the name you give it, it's always been there, going back to ancient times, and it always was extremely creative. Look at Rabelais, look at Laurent Sterne. Novel is the place where basically you ask the reader to be both credulous and critical, and you ask the reader to go along with a story, and in so doing he has access to all different forms of knowledge. And this is something that the novel achieves in all cases. And once again, it's not a genre because it's actually all genres at the same time, because it can embrace or it can include all genres. You have the dynamics, you have the theater, playwriting, poetry, thought, poetry, and the infinite variations on the novel are precisely due to that. And here I'm quoting Julien Gracq. It's Proteus. It has infinite energy in how it stages the fable of civilization. So the novel is not about to lie down before all other ersatz, because what do scriptwriters do? In their synopsis, they use novel form. They use novelistic devices in your series or in your scripts. You're constantly borrowing. Even if it's in a streamlined form, what is being used is the force and the dynamics is inherent to the novel form, and it will never be exhausted. We will continually be surprised by this.
Je m'appelle Dimitris Stefanakis. Je suis...
I'm Dimitris Stefanakis. I'm a Greek novel writer, and I would like to respond to the gentleman. I think that the future of the novel is the future of the world. Maybe we could define the contemporary world using 3 words: oil, electricity, and novel, to sum up the contemporary world. Yes, indeed. The Industrial Revolution, urbanization, thanks mainly to electricity and oil, this led us to the evolution of literature and to the appearance of the novel. Novels brought about publishers. The reading audience brought about book clubs and libraries. Otherwise, in the past, only the elite were reading books. I also want to say that the novel is not just about relating, it's not just about narration. Honoré de Balzac told us that the novel is more complex. In a novel, you can sum up the entire knowledge of an era. This is something that Balzac did in an extraordinary manner. And then we see the 20th century with its experimental mind. It's produced a number of seminal works, but it's put literature itself in danger. And now we are in an unbalanced and difficult situation. We are trying to assimilate innovative trends and still retaining the 20th century. I think that the novel will continue to live. It will endure because it's the literary genre that is in the best position to assimilate, to integrate everything that we know about, everything that we can imagine in the future. I would also like to say that the cinema is the child of the novel, because you know the main dimension of the classic novel was the cinema dimension. If you read Dostoevsky or if you read Balzac, you can see the whole action on screen. And then the filmmaker draws inspiration from the narrative of the novel. And this is what brought about cinema as an art form. For us, for me, the novel writer, as a novel writer, we have to take into account the cinema dimension of the novel, but also the fact that the novel can incorporate in itself everything that is happening in the world. I think we've passed the test of time. We've been through a whole series of experiments. So maybe we can now go back to the fundamental quality of the novel. We've done enough experiments on the novel. And to conclude, let me say that a world without novels would be a nightmare of the world. That's what I had to say.
Puisque c'est le tour des Grecs, je vais en parler.
Since it's the turn for us Greeks to speak, I will follow. I thought the topic was literature in football. If I had known that it was such a difficult topic, I wouldn't have come. What I'd like to say very briefly is that the role of the novel, if I had to define it, is to how you account for a person's feelings who's standing in front of their stove waiting for the water for pasta to boil. There's 10 minutes there where a person is standing without moving in front of the stove. There's no other way to express the feelings or the thoughts of that person except for a novel. Because what's your cinema going to do? You're not going to film for 10 minutes somebody who's looking at water boiling, waiting to throw the pasta in. So for me, the novel is something absolutely unique. And in the end, your question is, are we going to continue to be eating pasta?
Apparemment, oui. On va encore manger des spaghettis. Prenez le micro, là.
Oui, je veux bien.
My name is Gaspard-Aimé Janvier. I'm also a novelist. I would like to get back to the knowledge that is yielded by novel. And what Michel Lebris said, we heard that a novel is a form of knowledge or contains knowledge, and you gave many examples of a great novelist of the past. So this reminds us of the fact that there are two types of novels. There's a novel that's only of interest to today's readers. It's a sort of entertainment novel, and there's a space for it. And there's a novel that will be read in 100 years from now. Those will be sitting in your place. And this brings me to the following question. How readable will be to readership in 100 years' time? Because there are two sort of obstacles. We haven't talked about technology. This is not the topic of this discussion, but there are two threats looming over the future of the novel. First of all, concentration, that is the concentration of publishing houses in the industries at large, which means that there's a focusing on a very small number of works, and this is because of the media emphasis and because of the commercial emphasis. And the other obstacle is proliferation. When we listen to the more demented sort of discussions about this, but when we talk about how the novel can develop through internet, we could imagine a future where each human being, as Andy Warhol said, will be famous once in his life. Each person will have written at least one novel in his or her lifetime. So the question then will be, how will you sort it all out? How will you sort out so-called honorable novels who are good for immediate consumption, and the ones that have that power that explain why today we talk about people like Conrad and Stevenson, but we may not be speaking about many other novelists who were only writing, in essence, in response to an immediate need, and maybe they would simply lack the talent. In other words, they're only meeting a contemporary appetite. I think this sorting out, or this sorting, gets done because, contrary to what we often believe, is a history is just one way of looking at the past to give more depth to the present. And this is why the major viewpoints on history change every 10 or 15 years. It's not because the past changes, because the present has changed, and that in the whole mass of archival information, we're just digging up information that's different than we had, say, 10 years before that. So I was quoting Stevenson, which is a very fine example, because he was hugely famous at his time, especially at the end of his life. He was one of the most widely read authors in the world then, and his fame endured until about 1914. But then he was kind of rejected and confined to, children's or youth's literature or as entertainment for whole decades. And if you look at the critical observations on his work, the arbiters of taste, those who know and who pass judgment, for whole decades, they really relegated him to secondary status, ignoring or overlooking what's said by other writers said about Stevenson. Rimbaud was dreaming of adapting some of his works to the movies. Mallarmé believed that Stevenson was a genius. Proust also believed he was a genius, and the list goes on. And one day when I was listening to essays on fiction, Henry James, during his life, also believed that Stevenson was the greatest in his time. And Stevenson believed that Henry James was the greatest, so they had, there's amazing, actually, correspondence between the two men. But writers themselves always cited Stevenson as a truly great writer. Yet, for whole decades, he was literally forgotten. When Borges published the preface to the Casares, and this was a generation that prefigured the Latin American novel that was kind of Marxist. Anyway, this preface that was written was used and quoted by everybody. And the text starts with Stevenson says that, or Stevenson wrote in a biography that was published by Gallimard, a biography of Borges. They say he was coquettish. He likes to quote second-rank authors, but that's wrong. When Borges quotes him, and he summarizes Stevenson's position in an exchange with Henry James, but nobody could actually believe that he had thought about Romanesque art. And this is changing today. He's being rediscovered as a major author, but once again, for decades, he was overlooked. Why was he rediscovered? And actually, I know something about this because I helped to bring this about in France. It's because the times had changed, and we need to look in the past things to basically oppose to the avant-garde conceptual artists, thinkers. And so he was brought as evidence. So the way we look to the past changes, and authors can be sort of resuscitated, and that's not going to change. And I don't have concern there because things will get sorted out because the way we question the past is always the same. And it's true that new technologies are going to change some things, but I'm not that worried about it. I think that what I was talking about is really serious. That is to say that we're entering into a world that is dominated by flows, where things that tended to be stable are now going to disappear, or doomed to disappear. Then it's necessarily true that we're entering an era where the novel has a function, an essential role, because there's no other form that can articulate, that can enunciate in one form, can sort of hold everything that is flowing and shifting. And you can't do this with concepts. And it's not happenstance why philosophers are raising the question of fiction today, given the state of the world. Fiction is what withstands time. And you can take great, big philosophical era that is expressed by the mystery of the novel, Foucault, Deleuze, Barthes, who thought about how can you get around this problem that fiction is neither truth nor untruth. Foucault rejects it. He says it's not part of reason. It's not folly. Read his texts about the writers that he likes. Deleuze spends a lot of time trying to do away with the distinction between figurative and literal, because this is really a thorn in the side of his own theory. And likewise, Derrida says something that's really amazing. And he says, my major problem is that I was not gifted for the art of the narrative. This is true. But that era of conceptual thought is coming to an end. And the Nouvel Observateur was saying it's the major thinking gurus are coming to an end. And now we're entering into an era that requires a different kind of fiction. And to evidence, young philosophers are bringing it up again. So it's how can we think? How can we find a form that truly enables us to tell what can no longer fit into a conceptual mold? A novel says something. You cannot say that it's literal or take it as literal value, because if you could, then you would just say it literally, and it would be done with fairly quickly. Some of that is true for a novel. A novel sort of brings everything. It's kind of like a river that carries everything in it. You have thought, you have everything in it. But if you take out the philosophical, political, theoretical consideration, there's still the whole mystery of the story and the power of its resonance, how it resonates. That is what is left. That is what continues to resonate, is the power of fiction. It does say something, otherwise we simply drop the book, and yet it's not something that can be just said, enunciated. And it's not just by stringing concepts together that you can get to the same place. And this is why I believe, quite the contrary, that we are in an era where the novel is necessary to think about ourselves. And it's not an accident that right now in the English language world of the novel is in full effervescence. And here, the Francophone environment, we have the same thing. And all of these cultures who need to articulate things and express things, they need the novel to say what they have to say, so as not to be sort of broken up into pieces. And the novel makes that possible. Different narratives, everything holds together, and yet it's not reduced to a single truth. And I think it's especially true that in an era who's coming out of the era of ideologies, so we've had an overabundance of this, and the fact it doesn't end up in a single lesson, it can't be boiled down to a single lesson. So the richness there is absolutely necessary for our present times.
Est-ce qu'on pourrait peut-être alors prendre Leonora Miano.
Non, mais j'ai pas de remarques.
Leonora Miano. Everything has been said. There's nothing much that I can add, but I do have a question that I would like to ask to you, Michel, and to everybody here present. If we think, and we often do think, that the novel carries knowledge, that the novel is a way for us to meet the unknown of the world, we still can ask ourselves, how should novels be read, and how are novels being read? I don't think, well, you've talked about the children from the past British Empire, but we can also talk about us, writers from sub-Saharan Africa. I don't always think that the personal dimension, the creative dimension of our work, I don't feel that it is often perceived. I get the feeling that the uniqueness of the writer is forgotten about because readers, whether critics or the general public, want to find knowledge. They read our books from a documentary perspective. People will read my works thinking that they're going to learn something about Africa. They're not thinking, I'm going to learn something about Leonora Miano. I'm going to learn something about herself, about her neurosis. Her Africa is completely different from the Africa we will find if we go and visit a given country. No one really stops to think about what I put in my novels from myself. Are all novel writers read as creative writers? Are we not expecting some novel writers to just bring a testimony of places where we won't go because it's hot and dark and full of mosquitoes and AIDS? This is the question I'd like to ask. What you say is true. We continuously have to fight. What I find really awful in the vast majority of critics is this tightening of what's in a novel, just trying to bring it down to a few main topics without thinking about the writers. But be assured, if people reading your books, when I read your books, I can learn a lot about yourself, and many readers do the same. You shouldn't just think that all readers are the same. You know that critics very often, they know nothing about the book they're writing a critic about. When I worked for the Phoebus publishing house, I was asked to write prefaces, and after a while, a lot of journalists were working on prefaces, and a lot of journalists were protesting, saying that they had something else to do than write those prefaces. And therefore, they asked for the prefaces to be shorter. But then I was afraid of seeing the articles being shorter and shorter, and therefore being too reductive, forget about the insight of the novel. What is a novel about? It's about opening new horizons. And very often I feel a deep insatisfaction today because people ask me, what is the pitch? What is the story? What is the pitch of Les Mystères de Paris? What is the pitch of a novel by Dostoevsky? Dostoevsky or a novel by Faulkner. I know we're in a consumerism society. We want everything to happen quickly. We have no time, but really we shouldn't be too reductive, and you shouldn't have too reductive perception of what readers might get from a novel, even if we live in a time of everything going quickly. When we see people turning up to this festival, I find it's very reassuring, and it keeps the interest going. It's a wonderful audience, and if we get people here in Saint-Malo, all these readers are out there, and they clearly have a different relationship with the novels. It talks to them, and they want to learn about the inner worlds of the writers. This is what I want to see. This is what I want to believe. Anyone else?
C'est commode de réduire les...
But it's true that it's easy to look at African literature as a new discourse on Africa. But and people look at me and say, "But you're not a black writer." No microphone. Serge? Earlier, I was talking about the challenges. I don't think that the future of the novel is at stake. I'm not even considering for a second that the novel could disappear. But there are challenges and new challenges. And among those challenges, we've talked about proliferation. It's true that proliferation has changed the status of the writer in Europe. A writer is no longer the respectable man that it used to be before the World War. There's a deterioration in the status for financial reasons. In the past, a poet could live from writing poetry. Today, even successful novels don't necessarily allow their writers to have a comfortable life. So there's a change in our business. There's a change in the way our works are received. You were talking about the reductive approach to novels. We live in a reductive era. People want a speech, a pitch. When you're standing in a library with 1,000 new novels, you want to be able to decide in 5 minutes as to which novel you need or you should read. All those challenges will force the novel to evolve. And those challenges, to me, are not necessarily a bad thing. They're just hurdles that we need to overcome in our evolution. But if we think that we can be just like Alexandre Dumas, Stevenson, or Victor Hugo, who were known from Cuba to Siberia and read and talked about, this I think is not about to happen unless you write Harry Potter. So there's a change, there's a shift of the novel in the intellectual life and in the public life in our time that has changed the situation. It's not a tragedy, we just need to adapt. Just one comment regarding this challenge or confrontation with social sciences. In your presentation, you reminded us of the role played by social sciences. And you put a hold to that. But today, in many social sciences, there's something quite interesting. They look at the novel as a source of inspiration. Social sciences are using novels today as a source of documentation. This is why I'm also quite optimistic as to the future of the novel. Maybe novels will be everlasting. Look at psychoanalysis or psychology. They look at novels to try and explain things, to try and understand. Anthropology as well. Anthropology has a long history and a chaotic history, but anthropology today is looking at novels as sources of documentation. You're being overly optimistic. We shouldn't delude ourselves, thinking there is necessary a conflict between human science, social sciences, and the novel. Social sciences have to state that the inner world of human beings and our relationship with others can be analyzed by science. In other words, we can define a conceptual knowledge, the threat in fiction, and that's why I want to have a debate with writers, and I want to carry on this confrontation with writers in other fora. I'm quite amazed to see that more and more people in the field of social sciences are looking at the knowledge in fiction, at the power of fiction, but when they ask themselves about fiction, look at Pierre Bayard on psychoanalysis. What they want from the novel is to find new theories that have not yet been formalized by psychoanalysis. No. If we take it seriously that fiction is neither true nor wrong, it's just a different symbolic forms from psychoanalysis, it means that there's a knowledge that's not possible to boil down to a concept. It's going necessarily to escape the sociologist. The fact that there's a dialogue between the two, okay, but the reason social sciences are looking at the novel is an attempt by social sciences to look at Chateaubriand, Stevenson, saying, well, Stevenson talks more about the Samos Island, than Margaret Mead. What knowledge can we draw from the fiction? But it's not just about knowledge. He writes novels with characters. It's completely different in essence. And I'm really convinced that it's quite different from their perspective. The novel is not just a source of documentation. In a way, they're killing the novel while pretending to coax it. And I think the novel cannot be instrumentalized, utilized. The novel is there to bring about surprises, to be provocative. Lacan said something quite true when he was talking about critics. He said that critic is censorship of the voices of the unconscious or imagination. Critics is questioning the truthness of knowledge. The novel is doing quite the contrary. That's the whole point of literature and poetry. It's constantly new. The novel is born, a new novel is born out of previous novels. And we can explain this very simply. I look at you. I look at you in the eyes. Your face is not just flesh and molecules and cells. I can see your eyes, but I will never get behind. You have an inner world that I will never be able to penetrate. The temptation of social sciences is to find the key to penetrate your inner selves. But science explaining by silence means that there's replication and repetition. How can you think about the other, not boiling the other down to yourself? You can engage with the other, which is different from knowing the other. I can engage with the other. I can establish a relationship with the other. This is all about imagination. This is the power of imagination. It's the fact that you can connect with the other. And when I say you need to give a face to the unknown, you need to put a face on the unknown, this is what I mean. In the darkness, in the unknown, you need to look at faces, you need to recognize a sign. And it's not a choice that has to be made between rational, scientific knowledge. It's something else, and it's opening up a new space for humanity. Humanity means you can never penetrate the inner world of the other. All the dictators of the world carry sunglasses. Why? Because they're scared of others looking at them. It's your eyes are what makes you vulnerable as human beings. So I want to go back to the fact that each face is unique, it's infinite, This is what literature is about. It's a knowledge, but it's not rational, scientific knowledge. This is what I meant to say earlier on.
Oui.
Nick, you have the floor. Nick, go ahead.
My name is Nick Mhlongo from South Africa. I'm very much taken by this thought-provoking, talk. But I really think that the future of a novel actually is over-romanticized. And there's too much generalization here. Because I think where I come from in South Africa, you have to explain what a novel is and what a novelist is. Are we not overgeneralizing things here by saying all the sweet things about a novel? Do we have to look into different countries, actually? Because in my country, definitely, you have to explain what a novelist is and what a novel is.
Oui. Mais c'est votre boulot.
That's your job, is it not? Thank you. We're going to stop because we have to free the room. So it would appear that the novel has a fine future. And those of you who've been with us, please buy, read, and including of the writers here. And see you next year. We will continue these discussions in other forms. We believe them to be important. Thanks to all of it.